It was a Thursday evening when my granddaughter called me, her voice light, but too careful, the way people speak when they're about to say something they know will sting. I had just finished ironing the veil I embroidered for her, folding it carefully into the satin box I planned to gift her the next morning. The phone rang, and I smiled before I answered it. I still smiled even when she started with, "Grandma, I just want to say thank you for everything you've done." But then came the pause. Then came the words that still ring in my ears, sharp and polite. "Because of seating constraints," she said, "you'll be in the back row, near the doors." I didn't understand. I blinked. I asked gently, "I thought I was sitting with the family." Another pause, then, "Some of Kyle's family is fancy. I just don't want you to feel uncomfortable or out of place. You know how you are sometimes." That's when I knew. I am the woman who raised her, the one who gave up her quiet years for ballet recitals and flu seasons and late-night study sessions. I am the grandmother who taught her how to tie her shoes, who stayed up stitching the hem of her prom dress by hand because it mattered that she felt beautiful. And now, I was being asked to sit in the back, not because there was no room, but because there was no pride in me. I didn't argue. I said, "Of course, sweetheart," and hung up the phone. I'm Margaret. I'm 72. And this is the story of how I gave everything to the girl I raised like my own daughter, only to realize, on the eve of her wedding, that she wanted me hidden like a shameful memory. What I did next wasn't revenge, it was remembrance, and it changed everything. When my daughter died, Lacey was just 7 years old. I remember the way her small body folded into mine at the funeral, the way her fingers clutched my blouse like she was afraid I might disappear too. I was 61 then, already making plans for retirement. I had sold off my little bookkeeping business the year before and had begun to dream, in the quiet way older women do, of days spent in my garden, of visiting my sister in Maine, of finally sitting long enough to finish the patchwork quilt I started a decade earlier. Those dreams ended the moment I saw Lacey's face after the service, pale and wet and utterly lost. Her father was nowhere to be found. He had drifted out of their lives years earlier and made it clear he wasn't prepared to step back in. There was no one else. So I didn't think twice. I packed up her room, carried her into my little house, and started all over again. Raising a child in your 60s is not something people plan for. The body aches in ways it didn't the first time around. Your patience, while deeper in some ways, thins faster in others. The nights feel longer. The financial cushion you thought you had begins to fray, thread by thread, with every new school supply list and dental bill. But never once did I question it. Lacey became my purpose, my second chance at love. She lit up my quiet world with noise and need and those little sticky hugs that leave a mark on your heart long after the sugar has worn off. I remember sitting through parent-teacher conferences surrounded by women half my age. I remember the side glances, the subtle comments, the occasional confusion when someone thought I was Lacey's great-grandmother. I took it all with grace. What mattered was that she felt secure, that she had someone clapping in the front row at her piano recitals, someone braiding her hair before school, someone to wait at the bus stop with a thermos of hot cocoa when the snow piled too high. I did all of that and more because she was my girl. She was the last piece of my daughter I had left. When she got older and started looking at colleges, I drove her to every campus tour she wanted, even the ones 4 states away. I packed sandwiches and thermoses and extra mittens and waited patiently while she walked bright-eyed through buildings I'd never set foot in myself. She would glance back at me sometimes, smile, and say, "You're all I need, Grandma." And I believed her. I believed every word. I dipped into my savings when tuition came around, just enough to make sure she wouldn't have to juggle too many part-time jobs while studying. I didn't want her to feel the weight I had always carried. I wanted her free, light, able to chase the life my daughter never had the chance to finish. And so, piece by piece, I gave what I had. Not because I expected thanks, not because I wanted recognition, but because I loved her. That love was all I had left to give. Time has a strange way of softening pain when your hands are full of someone else's needs. Raising Lacey filled every hour of my day, and before I knew it, the girl who once cried into my shoulder on her first night in my home had grown into a confident teenager with opinions, dreams, and the same stubborn chin her mother used to tilt when she was determined. Those middle years were a patchwork of ordinary moments that stitched themselves into something beautiful. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and the sound of her feet thudding down the stairs. She loved maple syrup, but only the real kind, not that imitation stuff, and I always made sure to keep a bottle just for her. Evenings were often spent side by side on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, mine aching from the day's chores. She would read aloud from her textbooks, asking questions I didn't always have the answers to, but I'd do my best. There were trips to the library, afternoons baking chocolate chip cookies, and long walks where she told me about her friends, her crushes, her worries. I listened, sometimes giving advice, sometimes just being the quiet place she could rest. When she was the 12 and didn't get the solo at the Christmas concert, she came home in tears, flung herself into my lap and said, "It's not fair. I tried so hard." I stroked her hair and whispered that effort doesn't always win applause, but it builds something stronger. I meant it. She dried her eyes, and by morning she was practicing again. I still have the photo from her 8th grade graduation. She wore a lavender dress I found at the thrift store and hemmed myself. She stood with her arm looped through mine, both of us smiling wide for the camera. I remember thinking as the shutter clicked that this was a life I never expected, but one I would never trade. As high school rolled in, the pace quickened. She joined clubs, took AP classes, started working part-time at a bakery. Her world widened, and I was proud of that. It meant I had done my job. But with that widening came distance. Not unkindness, just the natural pull of youth away from what feels small and familiar. I noticed it in the way she started calling me Gran instead of Grandma, in how she hesitated before inviting me to school functions. I pretended not to notice. Love, I'd learned, is sometimes about letting go before they ask you to. Still, she came home most nights, still asked me to review her essays or quiz her for tests. When the college acceptance letters began arriving, we spread them out across the kitchen table and celebrated with sparkling apple cider. She had choices, real ones, and every time she smiled, I saw my daughter's eyes shining back at me. Those years felt like proof that love given freely over time can become something unbreakable, or so I believed. When Lacey told me she was engaged, I felt a kind of happiness I hadn't known in years. She called on a rainy Sunday afternoon, her voice full of laughter and something lighter than I'd heard in a long while. She said, "Gran, he asked me. He really asked me." I didn't have to ask who. I already knew about Kyle. She had spoken of him often, the boy with the good job and steady eyes, the one who made her feel safe. I remember sitting down at the kitchen table, the phone pressed close to my ear, and just closing my eyes for a moment. I had spent so long worrying about whether she would find someone kind, someone who could carry the softness of her heart without breaking it. Hearing the joy in her voice filled something in me that had long at quiet. Planning began quickly. Lacey came over with a folder full of ideas and pictures torn from magazines. She showed me venues, color palettes, and floral arrangements. I made tea and listened, even when the details flew faster than I could keep up with. She talked about lace and lanterns, about a vineyard location with white chairs and fairy lights. I didn't say much at first, just watched her face glow as she pointed to each page. When she pulled out a picture of a gown she loved, I offered to help. I didn't have much, but I told her I could cover part of the cost. She hesitated for a moment, then hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you. You always make things easier." That meant everything to me. Later, when she found the dress, I sat on the boutique sofa and watched her step out of the fitting room, radiant in layers of ivory. Her hands trembled as she looked in the mirror. "Do I look like a bride?" she asked. I smiled and said she looked like the future. And she did. She looked like everything I had worked toward, standing there in silk and light. I wanted to give her more, something she could carry down the aisle, something that felt like home. So I began embroidering her veil. It took weeks, my fingers stiff from the tiny stitches, my eyesight strained beneath the glow of the lamp. But I poured myself into every thread, weaving little patterns of ivy and roses along the edge, a nod to the garden she used to play in as a girl. I planned to give it to her the night before the wedding, wrapped in tissue, tied with a satin ribbon. And beyond all the details, beyond the expenses and the hours spent planning, I felt something deeper. I felt like I was walking her to the edge of a new life, the way I had walked her to her first day of school, only this time I wouldn't be holding her hand. This time I would be watching from the crowd, full of quiet pride, knowing I had helped her get there. At least, that was what I thought. The day after I finished the veil, Lacey called again. Her name lit up my phone just as I was folding the last of her embroidered edges into soft tissue. I answered with a smile still on my lips, expecting her to be calling about final details or maybe to ask if I'd come early to help her get ready. But her voice was different this time. Still polite, still warm on the surface, but thinner, careful. She started by thanking me again. She said she was overwhelmed by how much I had done, how grateful she was for everything. I listened quietly, a little puzzled, but touched. Then she paused. And what came next didn't feel like gratitude. It felt like a slowly closing door. She told me there had been changes to the seating arrangement, that because of space constraints, I would be seated in the back row near the doors. I didn't say anything at first. I thought I'd misheard. "The back?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought I'd be with family." Another pause. Then she said it. "Some of Kyle's family is fancy. I just don't want you to feel uncomfortable or out of place. You know how you are sometimes." I held the phone tighter. The room was so quiet I could hear the tick of the clock in the hallway. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I didn't have to. I knew. I knew in the way a person knows when someone doesn't want to look at them too closely. She wasn't worried about space. She was worried about me, about my simple dress, my worn hands, my plain voice that never learned to use the soft edges people wrap around wealth. I wasn't the kind of grandmother you show off to guests in pearls and heels. I was the kind who smelled like flower and lavender lotion, who wore old shoes and carried tissues in her sleeve. She didn't say she was embarrassed, but she didn't have to. It was there, in the way her voice dipped, in the way she rushed to fill the silence. "It's just easier this way," she added quickly. "I don't want you to feel out of place. Kyle's mother is particular." I smiled, even though she couldn't see it, and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you think is best." I said it because it was easier than saying what I felt. I said it because I didn't trust my voice to hold. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long while. The veil was still in my lap, the threads catching light like cobwebs. I looked at the stitches I had sewn, thinking about how I had imagined her walking down the aisle, proud, radiant, carrying a part of me with her. Now I realized she didn't want to carry me at all, not even in the room. Not really. And so I folded the veil again. Carefully, but something inside me had already begun to unravel. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chest, staring at the ceiling, trying not to let the words echo too loudly in my head. You know how you are sometimes. It wasn't the words themselves, really. It was what they carried. I kept turning it over like a stone in my hand, smooth on one side, jagged on the other. Lacey had never spoken to me like that before, not when she was little, not when she was growing. But now she was marrying into a world where I didn't fit, and she had no intention of making room. By morning, I had made up my mind, not out of anger, not even out of hurt, though that ran deep. It was clarity. A kind of quiet understanding that I was no longer wanted in the way I once was. And if I wasn't wanted in the light, I certainly wouldn't let myself be tucked away in the shadows like a mistake no one wanted to claim. I went to the small desk in the corner of my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the file folder where I kept wedding receipts and confirmations. Inside, neatly paper-clipped, was the catering contract. I had paid the deposit months earlier using my own credit card. It was supposed to be a surprise. Lacey had mentioned how much the food would cost, how Kyle's parents were stretched thin, and I knew she was worried. So I stepped in quietly. I never said a word. I just called the vendor, made the payment, and told them to keep the invoice in my name for now. It had felt good at the time, like I was still useful, still holding a corner of her happiness. But now that same invoice sat heavy in my hands, no longer a gift, just a reminder that I had spent money and hope on someone who didn't see me as part of her day. I dialed the catering company and explained that I needed to cancel the order. The woman on the other end sounded surprised, but polite. She reminded me that the deposit was non-refundable. I told her I understood. I didn't ask for the money back. I just wanted my name removed. I didn't want to be tied to something I was no longer welcome at. I hung up the phone feeling not lighter, not triumphant, but settled. Later that afternoon, I took the veil from its box and placed it gently back in the linen drawer. I smoothed the tissue, closed the lid, and sat down at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. The wedding was only days away, and I knew I would not be attending. But I wasn't going to disappear quietly either. There were things she needed to remember, and I would remind her. Not with noise, not with anger, but with the truth. She had forgotten. The morning of the wedding was quiet. I rose early out of habit, even though I had nowhere to be. The house felt unusually still, as if it too was holding its breath. I made tea the way I always did, steeped until strong, poured into the same chipped mug I'd had for years. The sun filtered in through the lace curtains, and for a moment it felt like any other day. But the silence was different. It was full of everything I wasn't doing. I wasn't laying out my dress. I wasn't curling my hair. I wasn't tying up the ribbon on the veil I had poured my heart into. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the letter I had written the night before. It wasn't long. Just a few sentences written in my careful hand, each one carrying more weight than the ink could show. I had included a photograph, one I had kept tucked in my nightstand for years. It was from Lacey's 6th birthday, the last one before her mother passed. She was wearing a pink dress with cake smeared across her cheeks, arms wrapped around my neck like she never wanted to let go. I was laughing in the photo, head tilted back, eyes closed. That moment was joy. It was home. I had chosen that picture not to hurt her, but to remind her of who had been there when her world cracked open, of who had stitched it back together while pretending not to cry. I didn't raise her to be cruel. I didn't raise her to hide love when it became inconvenient. I placed the photo and letter into a cream-colored envelope and sealed it carefully. I didn't write much on the outside, just her name. I walked to the mailbox and slid it in, listening to the soft click as it fell into place. That was my way of attending the wedding, not in person, not in silence, but in truth. Back inside, I folded laundry, watered the plants, made myself a sandwich I barely touched. All day I imagined the bustle of the venue, the rustle of dresses, the clink of glassware. I imagined the moment someone realized the food was not arriving, the phone calls that must have followed, the rising panic. I imagined Lacey glancing around the room, noticing my absence, wondering if I was late or simply missing. And I imagined that moment, the one where it hit her that I had chosen not to come at all. I didn't smile at the thought. I didn't feel vindicated. There was no satisfaction in it. Only a quiet ache, the kind that settles deep and doesn't make a scene. By evening, the sky had darkened. I sat by the window with a shawl around my shoulders, listening to the wind move through the trees. Somewhere, my granddaughter was married. Somewhere the world had changed, and I wasn't there to see it. After I mailed the envelope, I sat with the weight of it still in my hands, even though it was gone. That photo wasn't just an image, it was a moment captured so completely that every time I looked at it, I could almost hear Lacey's giggle again, high and bright like a bell. I remembered how she had insisted on licking the frosting bowl, how she had fallen asleep that night with her arms around my neck, her breath warm against my collarbone. She had whispered, "You make me feel safe, Grandma," before drifting off. Those were the years when love was simple. It didn't have to be explained. It didn't need conditions or performance. It was just there, whole and unquestioned. That picture had always stayed close, not because I needed to remember her, but because I needed to remember myself. I needed to remember the woman I had been when love required everything of me, when grief left no instructions, and yet somehow I had managed to build a home around it. That birthday had been hard. Money was tight, and I had baked the cake from scratch with what little I had in the pantry. I couldn't afford presents, so I sewed a stuffed rabbit from scraps of fabric and wrapped it in tissue paper. Lacey had loved it. She named it Miss Buttons and carried it everywhere for 2 years. When she outgrew it, she tucked it under her pillow for luck. That memory used to make me smile. Now it settled in my chest like a soft ache. Writing the letter hadn't come easy. I rewrote it 3 times. I didn't want to sound bitter. I didn't want to shame her. But I also didn't want to lie. In the end, I kept it simple. I wrote, "This is who I am. The woman you're ashamed of is the same woman who gave up everything for you. I didn't raise you to look away from where you came from. I hope one day you remember that." I read it aloud once, folded it slowly, and placed it behind the photograph. That was all I had to say. It wasn't an accusation, it was a reminder. A mirror held up to the version of herself she had been trying to forget. I didn't expect it to change anything. I didn't expect her to call. I knew enough about pride, both hers and mine, to understand that some silences stretch far beyond apologies. But I needed her to know that I saw what she had done, that I had felt it, and that I hadn't disappeared quietly into the back row like a ghost she no longer needed to acknowledge. That envelope was not a cry for attention. It was the last gift I could offer her. The truth, wrapped in memory and love, whether she wanted it or not. And I hoped, somewhere inside, that it would find her at the right time. It was 3 days after the wedding when I received a phone call from my cousin Marianne. We hadn't spoken in some time, but she had attended the ceremony along with her daughter, and her voice on the line sounded both hesitant and curious. "Margaret, are you all right?" she asked, not as a pleasantry, but as if she suspected something. I told her I was fine, just a little tired. She paused, then said, "Well, I suppose you heard what happened." I told her no. I hadn't heard a thing. She let out a low breath. "It was a mess," she said. "No food. People waited for over an hour. Some of the older guests had to leave. The in-laws were whispering the whole time, and Lacey looked like she was about to fall apart." I listened without saying much. I imagined the tables set without plates, the guests shifting in their seats, wondering what was happening. I imagined Kyle's family glancing at their watches, murmuring among themselves. The catering company never showed, of course. They had no reason to. The deposit had been canceled, the agreement null. No food meant no service. It was simple. Marianne kept talking, filling in the details I hadn't asked for. How Lacey's voice trembled during her vows. How Kyle's mother made a comment about poor planning. How some of the decorations looked unfinished, as if the team had been short on time or help. And then she asked carefully, "Did you know something like this might happen? Is that why you didn't come?" I told her the truth. I said I had chosen not to attend, that something had been said to me that made me realize my presence was more burden than blessing. She didn't press. She didn't ask what had been said. I think she sensed it was something personal, something still raw. Instead, she said, "Well, it's a shame. You were missed, Margaret. Truly." After we hung up, I sat by the kitchen window, watching the wind stir the trees. I didn't feel joy in knowing the wedding hadn't gone smoothly. I didn't feel proud or vindicated or smug. What I felt was more like a quiet affirmation, a confirmation that actions have echoes, and that silence sometimes speaks the loudest. I had never wanted to ruin her day. That had never been the point. But I also refused to disappear neatly into a corner while being treated like an afterthought. If she had truly believed I didn't belong, then she would have accepted the consequences of creating that distance. I went to the drawer and opened it, touching the edge of the veil still resting beneath the folded linens. I hadn't looked at it since placing it there, but in that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had nothing left to prove. I had done what was right, even if it was hard. And I had done it without malice, only memory. Sometimes that is enough. The days that followed were quiet, not in the usual way, but with a certain finality to them. There were no phone calls, no texts, no visits. Lacey didn't reach out, and I didn't expect her to. I imagine she was wrapped in the aftermath of it all, trying to manage appearances, placate in-laws, explain things she probably couldn't explain without facing parts of herself she wasn't ready to see. I found that I didn't miss her presence in the way I thought I might. What I missed was the version of her who used to crawl into my lap without shame, who used to bring me drawings she had made of the two of us in the garden. Stick figures smiling under a lopsided sun. I missed the girl who once believed I was the safest place in the world. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman I barely recognized, shaped by ambition, polished by influence, softened not by love, but by appearances. In the silence, I turned back to my routines. I spent time in the garden, pulling weeds, trimming back the lavender. The soil felt good in my hands. It reminded me of control, of care that yields visible growth. I wrote letters to old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some wrote back, some didn't. I baked a few loaves of bread and delivered them to the neighbors, simple things, honest things. The veil stayed tucked away. I didn't open the drawer. I didn't touch the envelope copies I had kept. I let it all rest, let it breathe. I didn't talk about the wedding with anyone else. Marianne had said all that needed to be said, and repeating the story felt unnecessary. It wasn't something I needed to justify. I wasn't angry. I wasn't nursing a grudge. What I felt was older, deeper. A kind of tired that lives in your bones when you've held someone up for too long, only to realize they've long since stopped reaching back. There were moments, of course, where the quiet turned sharp. I would hear a song on the radio that she used to sing in the kitchen, or pass by the bakery where we once bought cupcakes after her first high school debate win. Those moments pierced, but they passed. I let them. One afternoon, I stood at the kitchen sink, hands wet from rinsing apples, when I realized something. I wasn't waiting. Not anymore. I wasn't hoping for a call or expecting an apology. I had told my truth. I had protected my dignity, and I had done so without cruelty. There is something steadying about that. About knowing you did not shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. About standing still while someone you love walks away and choosing not to follow. The silence was not punishment. It was space. And I intended to keep it. Not as a wall, but as a boundary. One she would have to choose to cross, if she ever found her way back. 6 months had passed since the wedding when the envelope arrived. It was a cold morning in early spring, the kind where the frost still clings to the edges of the windows, but the sun tries its best to break through. I had been out in the yard, trimming back the dead branches from the rose bushes, when I saw the envelope tucked among the bills and circulars. There was no return address, but I knew the handwriting before I even opened it. It was Lacey's. I stood there on the porch for a long moment, the envelope in my hand, unsure of what I even wanted it to say. Part of me had moved on. Not away from love, but away from expectation. I had folded up my hope the way I had folded the veil, setting it aside for safekeeping. But now, here it was again, held lightly between my fingers. Paper soft from travel, the ink slightly smudged near the edges. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, no apology written out in full, just the photograph I had sent her, the one of us at her 6th birthday, her frosting-smeared smile pressed against my cheek, my arms holding her close as if I could shield her from everything. It was the same photo, but now there was something new. Written across the bottom in her familiar cursive, in dark blue pen, were 4 words. "I'm sorry, Grandma." That was all. I held the photo in my lap as I sat by the window, letting the words settle. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accompanied by flowers or phone calls or promises. It was small, but not insignificant. It was perhaps all she could manage. And maybe, for now, it was enough. I didn't cry. I didn't call her. I didn't rush to forgive or forget. Instead, I looked at that picture, really looked at it, and saw not just the child she had been or the woman she had become, but the unbroken thread between the two. She had remembered. Not just the moment, not just the birthday. She had remembered me. There is something about being acknowledged, about being seen again after being made invisible, that mends more than it breaks. That photograph had once been proof of how much I had given. Now it was something else, a quiet recognition, a whisper of remorse. I placed the photo on the mantel, just beneath the clock, not because everything was fixed, but because it mattered that she had sent it back. It mattered that she had written those words in her own hand. I didn't need a grand gesture. I didn't need her to undo what had been done. I only needed to know that she still carried a piece of me with her, that she had looked at that photo and remembered what love looked like before shame taught her to turn away. And she had. After I placed the photo on the mantel, I stepped back and looked at it for a long while. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock above it. I hadn't realized how bare that space had been until the photograph filled it again. It belonged there, not because it marked a wound, but because it captured something real, something that still mattered. There are different kinds of remembrance. Some come dressed in apology, others in action, but the most honest kind is quiet. It doesn't demand forgiveness or parade regret. It simply says, "I remember you, and I see what you gave." That was what her envelope meant to me. Not a plea for absolution, not a request to start over, just a single, unvarnished acknowledgement. It took time for me to decide what to do with that moment. I didn't call Lacey. I didn't send a letter back. I didn't need to. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be shown had already been received. In my heart, something had settled. Not fully healed, not forgotten, but quieted. For weeks afterward, I found myself noticing things with fresh eyes. The spring crocuses pushing up through the earth, the mailman's polite wave each morning, the way the air smelled faintly of lilac when I opened the kitchen window. Life continued, and I allowed it to, without carrying the heaviness that used to linger in my chest. I went back to my sewing, fingers steady now, the ache in my joints less sharp with the passing days. I even began stitching a new piece, not for anyone in particular, but simply for the peace it brought me. Each thread felt like a form of prayer, not for what had been, but for what still could be. Sometimes, when I passed by the photo, I would stop for just a second. Not every time, just often enough to let it root itself again in my heart. This was my granddaughter. This was the girl who once called me her whole world, and while that may no longer be true, what we had was not erased. It had been pushed aside, yes, maybe even hidden, but not lost. Lacey's words had not erased the pain of the back row request, nor the sting of being deemed out of place. But they had pierced the silence. They had reached back, even if only slightly, toward the truth we once shared. I did not need her to say more. I did not need her to do more. I only needed to know that the woman who raised her still lived in her memory, not as an inconvenience, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered, someone who gave, someone who stayed. In that, I found a kind of reckoning, a quiet one, shaped not by revenge but by remembrance. And for me, that was always enough. In the months that followed, I began to understand something I had never fully put into words before. Love is not about being front and center. It is not about being thanked loudly or celebrated in public. It is not about grand gestures or perfect endings. Love is quieter than that. It lives in the sacrifices we make without being asked, in the long nights spent rocking a child through fever, in the letters we never send, and in the ones we do. What I gave Lacey was never meant to be repaid. I didn't raise her expecting that one day she would put me on a pedestal or sing my praises. I raised her because she needed raising. I gave her everything I had because I could, and because I knew no one else would. That is what love looked like for me. Hands in dishwater, sleepless nights, rent checks signed with trembling fingers, birthday cakes made from scratch, dresses hemmed by hand when the store-bought ones never fit quite right. The mistake I made, perhaps, was believing that kind of love would be enough to make me unforgettable, that she would carry it always, clear and unshaken. But time and growing up and moving forward have a way of sanding down the edges of memory. People forget who held them when they were small. They forget what it cost others to keep them whole. But then sometimes, just sometimes, something slips through. A photograph. A note. A line written in a hand you know better than your own heartbeat. And suddenly the past stands up again and reminds you that nothing was truly lost. Lacey and I have not spoken since that envelope arrived. And that is all right. I do not need daily calls or handwritten apologies. What I needed was the truth to be seen. And it was. Every so often I take a walk past the little community center where she once performed her piano recital in the 2nd grade. I remember the way she climbed onto that stage in her black Mary Janes, hands shaking, face flushed with nerves. I had clapped louder than anyone. She had scanned the crowd, found me, and smiled so wide it looked like her whole body exhaled. That moment, more than any other, reminds me of what we shared. I do not know what her life looks like now. I don't know if she has framed wedding photos on her wall or if she ever told Kyle what happened with the catering. I don't know if she kept the veil or if she tucked it into a drawer like I did. But I do know she remembered. even just once. And that is what love is in the end. Not perfect, not always loud, but present. Even when it falters, even when it forgets, and especially when it finally remembers.